Pretty much everybody thinks that Season 5 of Game of Thrones is underwhelming, but why? Spoiler alert, this video talks about the things that happen in the series of Game of Thrones, from Season 1 to Season 5. A lot of people were lukewarm about Season 5 of Game of Thrones. The Mary Sue famously said that they're no longer covering any news about the show. Ratings dipped below the previous season's average for the first time in the show's history. And there are a lot of common complaints. The writing wasn't that good, the storyline in Dorne wasn't all that interesting. There's, of course, the copious amounts of violence against women, and I tend to agree. I was bored pretty much from the first minute of Season 5 of Game of Thrones. There have been things that I liked, and actually the season finale has left me in this strange place of feeling conflicted. I think it's very easy when media does things that we don't like to just say, well, that's garbage and I don't like it. The first thing that I want to say, though, is that I have absolutely no intention of diminishing the conversation surrounding violence against women in our media, specifically in Game of Thrones, obviously, with the rape of Sansa Stark by Ramsay Bolton. I don't disagree with many of the criticisms, but I want to present a different perspective. So the first thing we need to confront is that Game of Thrones, by its very nature, is a violent show. It is about the exchange of power for power's sake. With everything that's happened, it seems like this season has been sort of an attack on our safety, which the show has never particularly reveled in being safe, at least in terms of character death. Obviously, that's what it's renowned for. It becomes transparent that they're trying to shock you, they're trying to elicit strong emotions, they're trying to hammer in the point that this world doesn't care about the people in it the way that we care about them. But for me, the problem with Season 5 goes a little bit deeper than that. The first 4 seasons to me felt like one continuous arc. Everybody at the end of Season 2 is on the way to something different. Completely different from what they were doing before. So going into Season 5, suddenly it's almost like we're starting over from scratch again, because all of the major conflicts from the previous seasons have been resolved. But even that isn't really the crux of the matter, and I want to lead into this by talking about the death of Jon Snow. This season has felt like the sad chapter of the story, and I respect the showrunners for sticking with that decision and having this just be a finale of ambiguous deaths. As a rule, character deaths become harder to justify the longer your series exists. So Robb Stark dying in Season 3, that was rough, but it was a part of the fabric of the story. But now we have this thing going forward where we've built up this mythology about Jon Snow, because honestly the Wall story has not done a whole lot. It is providing the basis for what's probably going to be the final conflict of the show. But everybody's felt like there has to be something bigger going on with Jon Snow. He has to be, well, there's the prominent theory about his parentage, which postulates that he himself is a Targaryen. And of course, him dying at the end of this season throws a wrench in that. On the one hand, I want to believe that Jon Snow is not dead. Despite the fact that the creators and Kit Harington himself have said he's dead, he's not coming back. They could be lying, I don't know. I like Jon Snow and he really rose to the occasion this season. But we have to look at this problem of story mechanics versus audience expectations. If you've ever seen the picture of the bar graph of a story, that's what I'm referring to. It's sort of the rising conflict and the learning lessons and everything is sort of the outline of the bare-bones story that almost all stories are a variation upon. With long-form television the way that it is now, this sort of understanding of story mechanics gets really complicated, because especially in a show like Game of Thrones, we aren't necessarily sure who the protagonists are. We don't know what the major conflict of the show is. Now, whether you've studied narrative structure or story mechanics or not, pretty much everybody knows these things on some level. You can say, well, this story is like that story because you've seen them both and you know that there are narrative similarities. There are similarities in their arcs. You see how they align. So we have expectations of the media that we consume based upon the experiences we've had with previous media. The reason why Sansa Stark's rape is so upsetting is that we already know that Ramsay Bolton is terrible, and we already know that Sansa's life is shit. We don't learn anything new from that scene, and that's the thing. That's the problem that they're having to face going forward, is that we're putting characters in similar situations and we already know what's going to happen because we have been paying attention to the mechanics of the story whether we know it or not. It's transparently trying to punch the audience in the face, and it hurts. It's frustrating because season 4 promised big things for Sansa, and they just kind of turned around and said, no, she hasn't learned anything. Fuck it, who cares? Now going forward in Game of Thrones, I feel like we have had a set of expectations that the show never promised or even proposed to meet. The thing we have to understand is that the showrunners have their own vision for what this story is, and what seasons 1 through 4 were fundamentally is setting up the world and the characters. Season 5 on to whenever the show ends is now about the end of the show. Now it's about building up to this final conflict. We don't have time to waste in Dorne, which I hope is the lesson that they have learned, because while the books can just meander on forever, there are only so many hours in a season of this show, and not everything is equally important. And so what this show going forward is about is the end of the show, and this is a very different expectation than what we've had. I think season 5, the biggest problem with it is that we wanted more of what we already had, but what they are giving us is a prelude to what is coming. It's setting up the future state of affairs and taking its fucking time doing it, admittedly. The last question I want to ask is, to what degree do we believe that the show owes us a satisfying ending? I think that that's the major conflict going forward, because it's entirely possible that this whole thing has been pointless. I think when you're watching or experiencing any media, you're bringing your own values, your own life experiences. You're reinterpreting the material to fit your world. This is how old movies and old books continue to find new life, because despite the fact that they have emerged from the historical moment in which they were created, they can take on a new light in a new context. Right now, sexual violence and violence against women is a huge deal, and that's a fantastic thing, and I love that that conversation is happening. But I also wonder to what degree that conversation is currently informing the way that we see the show. Which is not to say that the show is more important than that conversation. It isn't. 20, 30 years down the line, hopefully people will watch the completed show and then we'll get to these moments in season 5 and they'll wonder what the hubbub was about. Do we need to adjust our expectations? Do we need to find a better approach to watching this show? No, not really. If you have the visceral experience that you're having, then nothing that I say or do can change that. So whether you liked Game of Thrones Season 5 or whether you didn't, I feel like it's short-sighted to write the show off altogether. Again, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable response, but I think it's better to learn lessons from the mistakes that other media have made than it is to swear off that particular form of media altogether.